lively discussion. So initially I wanted to share my desktop later on, but I will do this now. I hope it works. Can you see that?
We are waiting to,
Okay.
yes, now we can see.
Fine. First of all, I have to apologize because I too late recognized that I forgot to translate my thematic maps. So what you can see is all written and composed in German. That's why I'm sharing my desktop at the very beginning of my presentation, so you have time to accommodate to this map. And I hope that nevertheless you get some insights, and I will later on comment on that heavily, so never mind. Translation, and there should be no doubt after the first 3 presentations prior to mine, today is very much about the transfer of cultural images. But how does this transfer look like in detail? It's an easy question, but I guess a difficult answer, or difficult answers in the plural. So what seems to be an easy question remains unanswered quite often. So nevertheless, also abstract ideas and cultural images take their starting point from real places and locations, and as such are based on the movement and activities of people. In this way, I would like today analyze them from a strict material point, or rather spatial point of view, and add this approach to the analysis of cultural images, which we heard up to now today. In doing so, I'm asking about their production instead of their further perception and how they are dealt with. So my main questions in this respect were and are: who is responsible for the dissemination of these images, and in which places they are located? It is my aim, not only of the presentation today, but of my overall scientific work, to reveal certain mobility patterns of persons and objects. And as such, I would like to contribute to a general spatial thinking about translation history. My presentation today is divided into 2 parts. In the first, somehow shorter part, I do not want to bother you too long with that, I will discuss the existing theoretical methodological borrowings. So generally within the humanities, but also with respect to translation studies. So what is the spatial turn? What are its advantages and disadvantages? And mainly, how can it be implemented? Here it becomes apparent that theoretical considerations are so far only partially useful for practical applications. In the second part of my presentation, I will present and analyze some examples, all taken from my habilitation, which I'm actually finishing. In fact, I submitted it today from my habilitation at the University of Graz at the Department of Translation Studies. For this very purpose, I created some thematic maps, altogether 38 in my work, of which I would like to present and analyze with you 3 of them. So now we're going to part 1. In general, space as an epistemological category looks back on a long history within the humanities. But it was surprisingly only in the late 1980s, however, that this approach consolidated as an own category and therefore gained significantly in importance. It should nevertheless not be treated as a school on its own or a totally new method, but rather as an addition or expansion of already existing approaches. So there is no need of another turn in this respect. It was Henri Lefebvre who formulated a major contribution to this renewed interest. Back in 1974, he published his Production of Space in French, which was to become one of the pioneering contributions in the following years. It should be mentioned, and this is a kind of irony of history, that again, it was the translation into English at the beginning of the 1990s, so more than 15 years after the original, which initiated this renewed interest. In this work, which is hard to read and to understand, he extensively discusses his opinion that space is not only a mere condition of all human action, so the so-called container thinking, but on the contrary, and now I'm quoting him, that every social place is a social product. So the natural and therefore geographically perceivable space becomes in this understanding a social place, and as such emerges out of social activities. His understanding of space consists of three different dimensions which correlate with each other: a social imagination, an individual perception, and last but not least, a material practice, on which I would like to focus today. So the very material side of space. Within translation studies, space as an analytical category was for a long time of rather minor significance. Indeed, several works of different times mention spatial elements, but they never really constitute the very focus of their attention. So when critical aspects of space are mentioned, they always represent only an additional item of information. Very early, space was used even within translation studies, or within everything which is connected to translation, in its metaphorization. So see, for example, the translatio imperii studi, or the translation as a cultural and linguistic bridging. While more recent examples act on a more general level without exclusively or directly dealing with the act of translation. So Kershaw and Sardana, for example, back in 2013, speak of landscapes of translation as the natural environment in which translations are produced and received. But even Emily Apter's concept of a translation zone, and this overview within translation studies is very limited now, I'm well aware of that. Her concept of translation zone, not stone, is a rather theoretical concept in a figurative sense. While we can see such metaphors as a mere side effect of dealing with translation as a social event, they shape at the same time our understanding of translation and its conceptualization profoundly. So we should treat it with caution, but more about that later. An important step in the development of a more complex approach towards space as a known category was formulated by José Lambert back in 1991, when he pleaded for a globalized understanding of translation. He demanded an orientation to the translatorial everyday, the place where translation is produced and distributed, and, I'm quoting him, as the production of culture is influenced by a geographic cultural space. Further, it was Anthony Pym who at the beginning of this millennium again demanded a more critical consideration. There was still a lot to do. A traditional understanding of translation, he argues, and now I'm quoting him, surreptitiously excludes the space where the actual contacts are made and manipulated. And out of this understanding, Pym focused on a so-called frontier space in which physical contexts occur in the form of translation. But when translation is not confined to a political territory in advance, differences between subsequent places within that territory come into play. And so it was Lawrence Venuti back in 2005 who wrote about the local contingencies by which translation is determined. And he considers that any translation in fact depends on its capacity to engage with the intelligibilities and interests that define the social situation where the translator is working. Without going too much into detail now, but because this would take too much time, I would like to mention two further conceptualizations, one by Sherry Simon, who explicitly demands that the space where this translation occurs is to be taken seriously, à la lettre, so defined by the figures and trajectories that make translation possible. And last but not least, before that, she subsequently speaks of circuits of circulation, as we did today prior to my presentation, and as I did myself in my short abstract. I just would like to think about the very expression of circulation, and that we should treat that talking about translation and phenomena in a figurative sense with caution, as the very wording of circulation implies a recurrent movement along more or less fixed paths. And I don't think if that holds true for all the historical situations of translation, which we know. So think of the circulation of blood or of planets. That may be true in this context, that it circulates or that they circulate, but at least when it comes to my own field of research, multilingual and pluri-ethnic empires in the 19th and the 20th centuries, that's not always true. So maybe that would be a possibility to think this figurative thinking of translation. Finally, before I come to a conclusion of this first part, I would like to mention a case study by Lieven Dulst and Helen van Gerwen back in 2018. And they take a closer look at the reconstruction of the spatial characteristics of translation. So for them, the deciding reference point is no longer the titular nation, which is equated with one language only, but the deciding factor is which language is used in which context and for what reason. By that, they can reconstruct a highly complex system of direct and indirect influences and interactions. So much up to now about the important theoretical borings, but what is to be understood by space as an epistemological category? As mentioned before, there is no clear definition, and additionally, this approach developed over several years and at the same time in different disciplines. And this leads us to the question of formulating some basic premises, which could be useful in adopting this approach to translation history. And some of these premises I would like to mention now. So my first premise would be that to be a useful tool and a methodological device at the same time, space must be understood in its entity. So it's not sufficient enough to speak of it in a figurative sense or as a sociological category, but also from its material side. So space is also the natural space. Premise 2 will be that of relevance is not only the absolute position of people or objects in space, but rather their relation towards each other. As space is always a question of inclusion and exclusion, and therefore of the existence of borders and so on. The third premise would be, according to Henri Lefebvre, that a social space is a social product, and as that, it is not a static and unchanging condition, but space permanently changes and does not exist on its own, unchanged. And this presupposes that social spaces are only of limited duration, since they are bound to social processes of social groups. Yeah, now I come to the somehow longer second part of my presentation, in which I would like to present you several examples, as I mentioned before, taken from my habilitation. The goal of this map is to locate translation and its main agents and object in the natural space. So the following questions are in the foreground. Where are persons and objects located? On which path do they move? And in which relationship are they towards each other? So the starting point is that it not only refers to the actual act of translation, but takes a much broader perspective and includes the whole life cycle, not only of agents, but also of objects. And here in my manuscript, I've now written that I will share my desktop with you, as I did already at the beginning. Yeah, before I come now to how I conceptualize and how my maps work, I would like to thank my wife, Eva Kusner, with whom I closely work together in preparing these maps. In the first step, I conceptualized them on myself or on my own and prepared handwritten prototypes. Afterwards, we digitalized them with the help of Illustrator. So Eva, thanks a lot to you. In general, due to their high geographical precision, maps convey a degree of objectivity that they do not always live up to. In other words, maps also reflect only certain points, subjective points of view. It is therefore important to reveal them. In the following maps, my main aim or objective was and is still to show the relationship of agents and objects towards the Russian Tsardom, as my habilitation deals with that topic. The starting point of all my maps is a so-called mute map of Europe. So there are no rivers, no borders, and so on. And each map has different levels, which can and should be read on their own or all together, so in relationship to each other. In the top left corner, you can find the very topic of the map. In this case, it's a map about the activities of Johann Ferdinand Giessen. The big C in square brackets refers to his geographical position towards the Tsardom. So I collected different agents and different objects and classified them around certain groups. And members of the group C were born outside Russia but died in Russia. So in the top right corner, you can see a legend containing all the information of the map. And as we are dealing finally with a thematic map and not a normal, ordinary geographical map, we have additional visual elements in the map itself, such as short texts or small symbols. So a normal map consists of up to 3 levels, and they can be combined or read on their own. The first level concerns the life path of translators and or authors, and they are marked with green lines when they move into the Tsardom or move in the Tsardom itself, or with blue lines, which we can see later on, when they move outwards the Tsardom or Russia. A second level consists of objects, again of original as well as translations, and their localizations. And they are marked with the subsequent year of publication. So, for example, in this case, you have a publication by Johan Giessen published in Dorpat in the year 1820 in German. So they refer to a certain color code which is depicted on the right side in the legend. So black stands for German, and the fact that it's framed, that the year number 1820 is due to the fact that it's a monograph, while year numbers which are not framed are articles. And the third level of my maps consists of translatorial subspaces of one specific translatorial project, and they are marked with yellow circles. So while Giessen published different originals and translations in different cities, I'm always dealing also with one certain translatorial project, and this is located at the city of Kharkov. And this translatorial space, or in German, translatorischer Raum, consists, of course, of different subspaces, namely the place of conceptualization, the place of production, and the place of dissemination. And the publication concerning this translatorial space are in this circle, or at least touch them. So I consciously decided for such a heavily simplified system, as this is the information that is still most frequently available to us, and allows this methodological approach to be implemented in other research projects as well. So these 4 persons and objects are marked with the numbers from 1 to 4, while 1 is the author of the original, 2 is the place of publication of the original, 3 is the translator, or his working place, and 4 is the place of publication of the translation. But let us now turn us in detail to my first map, which you can see for the whole time now. The present map deals with Johan Giessen, born in 1781 and died in 1821. He's a typical agent of a scientific transfer in the 19th century. So he was born in Schaumburg near Frankfurt an der Oder, then studied in Berlin, and went later to Augsburg and Vienna before he moved to Russia at the age of 23. He's part of those numerous people who emigrated from German-speaking countries into Russia starting at the end of the 18th century. Due to military upheavals and political uncertainties, they emigrated in the search of work or only a better life. Giessen worked at different new established universities, such as the University of Kharkov, established in 1805, made a career as a university professor, and spent the rest of his life in Russia. Beyond that, he made a significant contribution to the establishment of not only of the newly established university, but also its chemical laboratory. In 1811, so only 7 years after he moved to Russia, he got professor in Kharkov. 3 years later, in 1814, he moved to Dorpat, today's Tartu, where he got appointed professor and dean of faculty. He died in 1821 in the city of Mitau, today's Jelgava. Giessen is an interesting example in several aspects. First, he's a very mobile agent of his time, in part, as I already mentioned, of a bigger movement of scientists coming from German-speaking countries. His scientific work is clearly divided into two parts. Before he leaves to Russia in 1804, he published several works, mainly in Berlin and Leipzig, all in German language, as they were addressed to the practical work of chemists. After his migration to Russia, his scientific works show, with respect to their language of publication, a clear distinction. His works in German are published in Baltic cities, namely in Dorpat and Mitau. They sometimes show two publication spaces, and one I connected with a black line, published in Leipzig and Riga at the same time. In this certain case, I have to mention that we cannot be sure that this book really got published in both cities, but it mainly served as a possibility to broaden its circle of potential readers. So while he published his German publications in Mitau and Dorpat, Kharkov and the University of Kharkov should be one of the few Russian-speaking centers of education and one of the few Russian-speaking universities in Russia at the time. So his publications there, exclusively translations, were in Russian. And finally, Giessen published several works in French, but this time exclusively in French. So I come to my second map. Sorry for this interruption. Here we are dealing with, can you see that?
Yes, we can perfectly see that.
Fine. So here's my second map. In this case, we're dealing with Nikolai Karamzin, one of the most influential Russian authors at the turn from the 18th to the 19th century. His Letters of a Russian Traveler, a fictional description of a journey made by a young Russian at the end of the 18th century to Central and Western Europe, is based on Karamzin's own journey around the French Revolution to Western Europe. And his letters were probably one of the first literary works by a Russian author translated in so many different languages. Again, the initial activity for most of these translations can be traced back to the author and to, in a geographical sense, to Russia itself. First of all, Karamzin translated his letter on his own into French, the then most important language of fiction in Europe, so at least from a Russian point of view, and published it, so this French translation, in Hamburg, while he supervised other translations. And it was Johann Richter, who was born near Leipzig and at the age of 24 moved to Moscow, who translated these letters into German. And he did this under the supervision of Karamzin. Initially, this German translation should be published in Riga, but were printed and then published in Leipzig due to censorship troubles. So again, outside of the Russian Tsardom. The translatorial space around Karamzin and his letters is again characterized by a very high degree of proximity. So the German translation subsequently served as the template for a series of second-hand translations, marked here with a black line or with black lines, mainly in Danish, Swedish, English, and Dutch. And their importance within the overall publication process is underlined by the fact that the German translation published in 1799 until 18 was the first complete edition of letters. So while the Russian editions prior to that, published in Moscow beginning in 1791, 1792, consisted only of some letters, it was this first translation into German which included all letters. So as I'm running out of time, I'm coming to my third and last example. I have to switch again. In this map, I'm dealing with August Schlözer, a well-known historian, publicist, and author of influential works. He was again born outside the Russian Tsardom in southwest Germany, then studied in Wittenberg and Göttingen, and worked for a short time in Sweden. Already as a young man, at the age of 26, he moved to Russia, where he became assistant and later professor at the Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. After his return to Göttingen in 1769, he stayed there the rest of his life. Within the Russian context, the Russian cultural context, he's especially known for his critical approach towards historiography, containing a lot of statistical information and based on the then at the end of the third quarter of the 18th century, newly introduced Hilfswissenschaften or auxiliary sciences of history, such as epigraphy, philology, and diplomatics, amongst others. In our context, Schlözer is an interesting example of a kind of pseudo-translator. In the introduction to the German translation of Karamzin's History of the Russian State, not to mix it up with the mentioned letters by Karamzin. So the History of the Russian State is one of the pioneering works on Russian history. It is said in the introduction to the German translation that Schlözer already started translating it. This wouldn't be of further interest to us, but the German translation was published in 1820, while Schlözer died already in 1809, so 11 years prior to that. So why does he get mentioned at all? So Schlözer was famous for a series of works about Russian history, mainly written in German and partially translated into Russian. So again, Baltic cities such as Riga and Mittau served as the places of publication. And on the map, you can see I depicted only works with regard to Russian history written by Schlözer. Second reason why he got mentioned in that introduction, already he was dead for some 11 years, is that Schlözer lived for a long time in Russia, for more than 8 years, and he got to know most of the influential persons in academic and political circles at that time. And finally, he had a very good command of Russian, which distinguishes him from most of the German-speaking scientists at that time living or working in Russia. In that respect, and based on these three reasons I mentioned, his life journey and his productivity as a scientist very much correlates with this picture of him as a prototypical mediator between cultures and languages. I'm coming now to the end of my presentation, as I'm running out of time. Which findings can we draw from these maps, and how can we profit from a strict spatial approach to translation history? First, it gives us the possibility to examine movements of agents and objects in space, and as such, get deeper insights in the process of translation. Spatial elements are normally not given any attention as such, and serve as a very valuable additional information. Secondly, the visualization of movements brings us to movement patterns, which allow us to analyze translation as a social activity in more detail, going beyond the actual act of translation. And beyond that, we can see these movements simultaneously on one map, and which, by the way, can be of interest not only to translation studies, but as I hope to other academic disciplines as well. And finally, we can critically question existing images and views concerning translation, such as the figurative thinking of a circulation of translation. And as I hope to show today in my presentation, it makes a huge difference if authors, translators, and their subsequent works come together at one and the same place, or if these translatorial subspaces of conceptualization, production, and dissemination are carried out by different agents which show no relationship to each other in different places. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Philip. That was really impressive. And yeah, we have to move to questions and answers session. Luke, do we have
Yes.
do you have participants who
Yeah,
would
yeah,
like
we do
to
have
ask?
a question. You're not the only one, Irina, and not only me either, who found it fascinating. That also goes for Janneke, that's our professor of classical studies. She asked the question before. And she has a concrete question, Philip, about Giessen. And now there's a next question, and then I don't see her question anymore. Yeah, how does his membership in the Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg come into play there? And have you also counted his articles in scientific journals? Well, that relates to a question I had in mind about what is the importance of counting and how determining is it compared to other relationships you study? Maybe you can combine that.
Yeah, thanks for this question. I'll just read through it again because I have to collect my thoughts about that. How does this membership? Maybe, yeah, with respect to Giessen and in general, I decided to compose a model, an approach, spatial approach, which can be easily implemented in different other situations as well. And that's why I started, okay, which information we have normally. And normally they consist of the name of the author and the translator and subsequent originals and translations. And that's why I started just normally counting them. And in fact, and then step by step, I could create a map which probably shows that the way we think of translation is heavily influenced by the fact where one works or lives and leaves after the time or the moment he or she translates. That was the initial thinking about it. So I don't know if that answers your question. Maybe you mixed up a little something with, because Giessen was no member of the Academy of Sciences in St. Petersburg. That was Schlözer. Yeah, that was.
Well, the Tartu University history materials tell also, I think it was Reken Apirski also who told that he was a member of the academy, but I'm relying on the materials of in Estonia on the history of the university.
Fine, so thanks for that hint, for that additional comment. So maybe you know more about him than me. Yeah, I did not count his separate articles in scientific journals. As you can probably imagine, that would be too much. And what I did not mention in my presentation is the fact that my habilitation is also divided into two parts. And the first part deals with Karamzin as a case study, a kind of case study, and the dissemination of his Russian history. And the second part is based on a database which I prepared myself, and it consists of all translations which I could get hold of, irrespectively of their language combinations, but published within the Russian Tsardom. And out of this, I tried to build up a kind of taxonomy. So there are different groups, and the one I marked with the big C, when you remember that, and I wanted to show that there are different paths and different movement patterns between these different categories.
In the next remark by Jannica, yeah, you have to watch out what you say in when it's about national and cultural images, of course. Now there's the next question again. So yeah, you sometimes mentioned lived in Russia, and why not in Russia's Baltic provinces? That's more like a remark, I think, than a question. But it is of course a sensitivity when it is about a conference in Tartu, or maybe you have a good reason for that.
No, not at all. I have to apologize that I'm so used to it to talk about the main objects of my inquiry, of my scientific work. That is, are they inside Russia or are they outside Russia? Of course, I'm going into detail in my work about that, and there is of course a difference. And what I maybe not mentioned at all today, but I'm heavily commenting on it in my work, is the fact that there is not the one and only Russia. There's, and maybe as you have seen on the map of Giessen, that there's you cannot equate Russia with Russian. And as you've seen, there are several cities with several histories, and of course in the Baltic cities there's a strong German tradition, while in Moscow there's a strong French tradition, and in the newly established university in Kharkov they wanted to establish a strong Russian tradition. So but of course you're right, it's you cannot, it's not the one and only Russia.
Okay, next question is interesting because that's about the advantages of visual mapping. How did you get to that? What are exactly the advantages? What is the added value, one could say? So maybe it's important to elaborate a bit on that as well.
What is the value? Also, I hope there is a value, but tell me if it is not. My initial starting point was the fact that I was so bothered with some theoretical considerations, and especially in my own social environment. And they asked me, "What are you doing now? You're writing a habilitation?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm doing some work on translation history and so on." And I was looking for a kind of methodological tool or device to show them at a glance what I'm doing, which is at the same time interesting and revealing, but understandable. And then I came to the fact that when I translate or transfer my thoughts, my written thoughts, into visual illustrations, that helps me very much. And at the same time, not only me as a scientist within translation studies, but beyond that, as I mentioned in the presentation, that I guess this is a good tool to broaden the interest beyond translation studies as an academic discipline. Because when I showed that to historians of East European history, for example, they all said, "Oh, that's interesting. Now I understand what you mean." And that was also the initial goal of my illustrations. And finally, we have a material turn, we have a spatial turn, and of course we have a visual turn. And I very much have the impression that, although I do not like these fancy words, but some of the what it contains is right, and that we have to get up to other disciplines that's working with illustrations, not only within the digital humanities, is done in several other disciplines, and translation studies should catch up. So at the moment I'm preparing, I know these images I present in the form of a map, they are kind of static picture of one situation. So of course I have whole life cycles, and it is not only the situation in the year 1809, but at the moment I'm trying to move these maps and pictures in the form of a story map, so that you can scroll through it, and then you can move through the map, and then you get an impression from different angles.
Yeah, more than one participant asks the question, what tools exactly do you use for visualizing that, and based on what criteria do you select them, I suppose?
I have to suppose, as I'm not a IT expert, and neither is my wife. She's a photographer mainly, and I started by handwritten prototypes with the cranes of our sun, and I tried to put all imported things together and if they are still understandable. So I showed them to people from outside academic circles. And then the very last step was, this was a long process, I have to admit, it was, we crawled all the time about the right visualizing aims and tools of our maps. And the final step was to digitalize it with the aim of Illustrator. It's Illustrator.
Node code is suggested by one of the participants.
Thank you very much, even in German, for that hint. I haven't heard up to now about that. I had the impression that at least my wife is very experienced with Illustrator, so she could help me. Now I can handle it on my own. But Illustrator has the very advantage that you can draw whatever you want. It's just like a sketchboard, yeah. And then you can, and it's a so-called I've forgotten the kind of software, but what you draw, you can enlarge on whatever size you want. So it's a vectorial program, and not another picture on its own. That's also another advantage.
If you want me to, I can just say some words about NodeCode, because it's so, I'm sure it would be of great help. The thought is that it's like a data bank where you put in all the data about all your protagonists, and then you can really combine them linked to Google Maps and even historical maps. So you can make exactly what you did, just that it's also automatically is like movable, like you have this timeline and then you see your persons moving around. But you can also link your different subjects, both like manuscripts, texts. You can put in all that. It's like a huge database, and link it together, that you scroll on the city and the person and you see the manuscript, and then you see directly on the next level of the map who has translated it, who has written the review and stuff like that. You can even use like options to make a network scheme where you see who is connected to whom. You can put in all letters from like within a network of researchers. In the beginning of the 19th century, I'm working in the same period. So it's really, it's unbelievable many options, and it's kind of easy to use, because you don't have to be able to program or code or anything. It's just like using your the information you have on your material, on your persons, and then it will be linked like all together. And the database you build can be then used, if you want to, by other researchers using like linking to their own projects. So it's very cool.
Very interesting. Thanks. I should have heard about that at the beginning of my work, but nevertheless, thank you very much. That sounds very interesting.
That you submitted your habilitation this morning, but maybe you have to withdraw it now and upgrade.
Yeah. No, I won't touch that book again.
Can I ask the question myself? I think we went through all the others, which is more at that conceptual level, which was interesting too, because you referred to the fact that we had been using circulation of translation before, but in a different meaning or from a different perspective, I would say. Of course, when we use circulation of translation, it's mostly about translation flows, which is many translations, which is more collective, whereas the starting point you use is more from an individual point of view, I think. And to what extent are they contradictory, the relevance of the individual translation and even individual trajectory compared to the collective relevance of translation flows? And in that regard, you also talk about movement patterns. It's interesting to know, where does a pattern start, I think? How do you detect a pattern? Is that on a quantitative basis, or how do you do that?
Thanks for your remarks. Of course, you somehow you catched my initial thoughts, and I very often used, as well as in my abstract, used the very notion of circulation as, but rather not taken from translation flows, as you rightly remarked, but rather from the circulation of knowledge, and this kind of thoughts and approaches. And it was just a minor remark. I did not want to criticize
No.
anybody else who is using this expression, but again, I was thinking about it. Our thinking and our talking about translation is heavily based on a figurative thinking. And is that always the right approach to that? It is complex on its own, and it gets even more complex when you use this kind of language. But that's only my personal opinion about it. But we need these figurative expressions, and I'm using them on my own, so I do not want to exclude myself. The other question was how to detect a certain mobility pattern. At least with respect to my database, I collected some 1,803 translations, mainly from the Library of St. Petersburg and from Warsaw, because they have excellent digital collections. There you can ask about translators and translations and Perewurt and Perevedenie and so on. And then I tried to classify them into at least 4 groups. So they were marked by different letters. Yeah. So I have, for example, for the group C, so the members of group C were born outside Russia, the Tsardom. So by the way, in my work, I'm using the expression Tsardom and not Russia. So just to, but it's another topic. And so I collected up to 150 persons of this group C, for example. And they all have more or less similar movements. And then I said, okay, I could say that they represent certain movement patterns.
Okay. Thank you. Irina, you're still chairing. I don't take over.
Do we have any more questions in the chat, or anybody raised their hands? Because I saw some people, Benjamin, for example, raised their hands and then disappeared. So maybe they changed their mind and have the last chance to ask their questions.
I see there is how to access this database of translations by Yannick Paul. At the moment, you have to come to Graz. But if you're interested, so it is part of my habilitation of the printed version. I can give access to you if you want. Concerning the maps, I will publish them as an atlas of translation, as a cartography of translation. But yeah, I can send you that afterwards, so we can stay in contact. But as I mentioned before, towards Luc, that I mainly got access to these translations published in the Tsardom from the state library located in St. Petersburg. So they have an excellent online catalog, and yeah, but we can stay in contact and exchange each
other. Okay, thank you very much. Does anyone else want to ask questions to Philip, or maybe to the other participants who are still there?